When we conduct the analysis to describe our sample and test our hypothesis, we don't report results for each item or question. We report results for variables. I think I mentioned that can get a little confusing since SPSS also calls each of the questions variables. I'm not sure why they do that. Anyway, for our purpose, a variable is the score on the scale or subscale. And to determine that value for each participant, we usually have to compute a scale score. We learned a little bit about this when we found a measure for the proposal. Now we're going to complete the actual computation for a score. The process in SPSS starts at the same point we started with reverse scoring. We have a data file open, and go to the Transform menu and select Compute Variable. That takes us to a dialog box that looks like this. It might seem a little complicated, but the idea is similar to writing formulas in Excel, if you've done that. There are three key parts to this dialog box: the target variable box, the variable list, and the numeric expression box. I numbered them in this slide to make it a little easier to follow. The box next to the number 1 that's labeled target variable is where we enter the label we want to use to identify the scale. It needs to start with a letter and can't include any spaces. The list of items we can use in the computation is labeled 2 in this slide. And it's just like the list on the left side of the reverse score dialog box. And the box labeled 3 is what SPSS calls the numeric expression. That's where we tell SPSS how to compute the score. We have a few options for how we use this box, but for now it might be helpful to think of it as a place where we write a formula to compute the score. If the word formula sparks anxiety for you, try not to worry. SPSS makes it pretty easy. You can also think of this as telling SPSS what to do, which means you are in charge and you do know what's going on. We'll move the items we need from the list on the left by either double-clicking or using the arrow between the list and the numeric expression box. Before we do all that, though, we have to refresh our memory about what to include and what formula to write. At least part of the information will be in your notes from when you found the measure when you were designing the study. If you didn't include a screenshot or specific information, you might need to go back to the article or the articles that describe the process of developing the measure. For the short grit scale, we know what to include because of the way the items were organized in the table in the article that talked about the version of the measure. You might remember it was a little trickier to figure out how to actually determine the score, in other words, what the formula would be. After looking at a couple of sources on the web and the results of the study using the measure, I figured out that we average responses. We can start working through the process of actually computing scale scores by naming the variable, which means we put a label in that we want to use for the score in the box below where it says target variable. SPSS is pretty particular, so the label we enter needs to start with a letter and can't include any spaces. Shorter labels are also easier to work with, since we'll only see the first several characters in a lot of the other places. The list of the variables in this slide is an example of what we'll see in all the SPSS analysis dialogues. I'm going to use the consistency of interest scale as an example, so given those considerations, I just typed the word consistency in the box to label this score. After we label the variable or the score, we'll tell SPSS what to do to compute that score using the information that we noted earlier. We have a few options for exactly how we tell SPSS what to do. I'm going to show you how to use SPSS to enter the actual formula, so all you have to do is tell the program what variables to include. To start that, we need to find the section of the dialog box labeled Function Group. It's circled in this slide. Then we scroll down that list until we find the group labeled Statistical, and when we click on that, we'll see a list of the formulas we can use. We know the average is another way to say the mean, and our notes remind us the score is the average of the responses to the items in the scale, so we'll select mean. If we click once on an option in the list, the program adds an explanation of the function to the left of the box. If we double click, it fills in the formula in the expression box, and that's what we want to do. So we double click there. And this is what SPSS adds to the numeric expression box when we select mean. To compute the mean for our score, we'll replace the question marks with the items included in the score with a comma between the items. Notice that it only includes 2 variables in the initial formula, and that does not mean we're limited to 2. We can keep adding as many as we need with a comma between each one. When SPSS adds the formula in the box, it'll automatically select the first question mark, so we can replace it with the first item in the formula. Our notes indicate that we need to include items 1, 5, 6, and 2, so we can start by finding the first item in the list. For the examples, I labeled each item with an abbreviation for the scale name and the item number. So I was looking for the item that was labeled SGS1. Once we find the one we're looking for, we can double-click on it to add it to the formula. To finish the formula, we'll highlight the second question mark and use the same process to replace it with the second item. Then we'll use the comma key on the keyboard to add a comma before we double-click on the next item in the formula, repeating that process until we have all of the items in the formula. The consistency of interest formula looks like this when it's finished. Notice that there isn't a comma after the last item, just the ending parentheses. The last step is to click on the OK button to tell SPSS to do its thing. SPSS will add the information in the output window so we can confirm that we included the right items and use the correct formula. The column with the score is added at the end of the data file, so it can seem like it's hiding a bit if the data file has a lot of columns. Now we're ready, finally, to do the statistical analysis, to describe the sample, and to draw conclusions about the variables.